And of course, it's not a single occurrence. So if you just think back into the history of the last 20 years, maybe even 10 years, we had a whole range of very severe, very significant transatlantic conflicts. And interestingly, the issues are not peripheral, marginal issues. The issues are quite wide-ranging. They're very important. And some of them go to the fundamentals of the political relationship between Europe and the United States. So let me just take you through some of them, some of the transatlantic conflicts over the last, say, 10 to 20 years. The fundamental issues that they touch upon are the meaning and exercise of power, including the use and the role of force. Just think of the Iraq War of 2003 and the crisis in the transatlantic relationship that created. But it's broader than that. It spans a whole range of what we could call global governance issues. So whether it's the legitimacy and scope of multilateralism or specific multilateral institutions, think of the role that the United Nations plays or doesn't play in US foreign policy versus the role that it plays in the foreign policy of European states. For example, Germany, a country that I just mentioned, has been trying to get a permanent seat on the Security Council for at least a decade now. So obviously it thinks that the United Nations is very important. Whereas if you talk to US policymakers, unless you ask them specifically, what do you think about the UN, or what is it supposed to do, they will never tell you because they just don't care. Right? Then there are other issues having to do with multilateral institutions. Think of the transatlantic disagreement on the International Criminal Court that the US is very vehemently opposed to. Or much more general, fundamentally, is the role of international law. How binding is it supposed to be? Should international law be deepened? Or is it something that you can sort of break whenever national security or the national interest, as you yourself define it, is at stake? Apart from these sort of fundamental issues, there are a lot of substantive issues, and I'm just going to mention them. I think it's self-evident that these are very important issues. So I think transatlantic partners disagree on climate change, on the war on terror, on the current use and the future of NATO, on the development of tactical nuclear weapons, on the issue of nuclear test bans, on the Arab-Israeli conflict, on tariffs and agricultural subsidies, on genetically modified food, on landmines, on the enforcement of bans on chemical and biological weapons, and on the treatment of the captives at Guantanamo Bay, etc., etc., etc. So the whole long list of substantive issues, and underlying these substantive issues, I think there are quite a lot of fundamental issues. So that all being said, does it mean that I think that the West is in terminal decline? What do these scandals and differences and disagreements tell us about the current state of US-European relations? Many analysts would say we do see terminal decline, or at the very least we see continued Atlantic drift. So the argument being that during the good old days of the Cold War, when everything was nice and clear, there was a unified West, and there was a clearly defined threat, that in contrast to these golden days, these supposedly golden days of the Cold War, we are seeing at least transatlantic drift, maybe even terminal decline. So I'm going to make a few arguments, and the general bottom line of it is going to be that I'm far less skeptical than many of those who are arguing for drift or decline. More specifically, I'd like to make three arguments, and I'd like to take you through the arguments before I go through the main body of the lecture. So if you don't like the arguments, that's great, and let's talk. If you do like them, all better. So my first and major substantive argument is that the West is undergoing a long transition phase at the moment. And the outcome of that transition phase is uncertain. So whoever tells you the West is in decline, prediction. Whoever says continental drift is going to happen, well, maybe it's going to happen. But the point I think that I try to make most forcefully today is that it's a transition phase and the outcome is uncertain. And the main body of my talk is going to be, I'm going to outline two trajectories or scenarios, if you will, two ways that I think the West could develop. And there's reason to believe that the West would develop either in one or the other trajectory. So long transition phase and uncertain outcome. But then, maybe more fundamentally and maybe more interestingly, I'd like to make two more analytical arguments, which are more about how do we think an issue like this through. So how could we start thinking about something as complex as the future of the West, the future of US-European relations? What are the factors that we have to take into account? We will then, of course, disagree on the factors, but it would be nice to kind of know what to look for. So what are signs of decline? What are signs of drift? What are signs of renewal of a relationship? Let me start with the substantive argument. The argument that the West, I think, is in a long transition phase and that the outcome is uncertain. So as I said earlier, most analysts who write about transatlantic relations will give you more or less skeptical, maybe even bleak and grim picture. So as one of them writes, and that's a quote, says that the unity of the West is more and more questioned. The scenario of a united West is just one scenario among many others, and it's not the central scenario anymore. And I would disagree. I think that there are a lot of questions about the future of the West and how specifically the future is going to pan out. But I don't think that it's true to say that the West as an entity, the idea of transatlantic relations, is not a fixed point anymore. I do think it is the fixed point. I think it is the central way, the most popular way that at least Westerners think about sort of the larger political future of the European states and the two North American states. I do think it is the central one. And that's part of the reason why there's so many writings and talks about the crisis of the West, because it is still the dominant sort of paradigm, the dominant concept, the dominant sort of map, if you will, that people think about it. But that's not to say that it's the only one, and I'm going to talk about two trajectories. So the first trajectory or scenario, if you will, is a fairly simple one. It's one that's been written about for ages. It's one either of decline of the West or a resurgence of the West. Right? So the idea is that either we're seeing some kind of fizzling out, decline of the transatlantic partnership, or we're seeing sort of a rise, again, sort of a renaissance, if you will, a revival of the West. So it's a very simple way of thinking about it, right? So the fixed point is the West, and we're just trying to find out, is it rising, or is it sort of reviving itself, or is it just continuing to drift, or continuing to decline? So it goes either one way, or it goes the other way. That's the first trajectory. The second trajectory that I'm going to talk about in 5 minutes is more complex. But let me stick to the first one. So either the West is rising, or it's continuing its decline, or its drift. What might be the factors that are important? So how can we assess, how can we try to measure, gauge whether something complex and big, like the transatlantic partnership, is rising or declining, or is sort of bouncing back? So let me just take you through 5 factors that most of my colleagues usually use when they think about these things and write about these things and talk about these things. So let me talk about first the 5 factors that might be pushing the West towards a renewal. right? The factors that work in favor of transatlantic cohesion. If you will, the factors that might make those who like the West feel good about the West and hopeful for the future of the West. First of all, the first factor that people usually write about is functional pressures. Right? So the argument is that there are just a lot of problems that need to be tackled, not by each individual state, but by the West as a whole. And these functional pressures abound. So obviously we live in a complex world, a complex world that needs collective action, and it needs integrated solutions. It doesn't need unilateralism, and it doesn't need sort of piecemeal solutions. It needs collective and integrated solutions. More specifically, what might these tasks be? I would say among the most important are fighting climate change, managing the global economy, managing the rise of emerging powers that I know you talked about earlier, the rise of the BRICS and others, fighting extreme poverty, dealing with failed states, managing regional conflicts and regional stabilization, and fighting organized cross-border crime, including terrorism. So there are a lot of issues there. So there's a lot of scope for joint solutions. In the West, because it has been around for a while, and because it does have quite a few important states and organizations as part of its institutional structure, it should be well placed to tackle these issues. If the West is disunited, those issues are not going to go away. They're just going to remain unsolved. Second factor that is often used in writings about the West, it's economic interdependence. Right? So it's an argument we've heard 1,000 times before, so I can just sort of very briefly browse through it. So obviously we live in a highly integrated economy, especially the North Atlantic region is even more highly integrated than the rest of the world economy. So just if you think of just one number, I'm not going to give you a lot of numbers, but just one number. So commerce across the Atlantic is massive. It accounts for 1/3 of global trade. So just the Western states, just the EU states, let's just assume we're talking just about the EU here. The EU and Canada and US, 1/3 of global trade is being handled within that region. So the costs of significant long-term political disagreements, the costs of not managing economic problems would be very highly significant. So hopefully, the argument goes, economic interdependence is going to keep pressing the West together, it's going to keep pushing it back, and it's going to help with a renaissance of the West. And there are some signs that we can look at and argue that there are some signs, positive signs in that direction. So just last week, as I'm sure you've heard, the EU Commission and the United States have started to negotiate a free trade agreement called the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP. That is going to take a very long time to negotiate, but if it did succeed, this would represent the largest regional free trade agreement in world history. And it would cover more than 40% of the world's GDP, and it would account for large shares of world trade and foreign direct investment. And the expectations are huge. Right? So on both sides of the Atlantic, the European Commission has said that it expects 400,000 new jobs to emerge from the free trade area, as well as annual gains of 120 billion euros for the EU and almost 100 billion euros for the United States. So of course, these are promises. Even if the trade agreement would fall far short of this, it still sounds like a great project. So there are some signs that economic interdependence are pushing the West, the Western partners towards each other, perhaps leading to a renewal of the West. Third factor, institutions, institutionalization. So I think without exaggerating, I think it's fair to say that the North Atlantic area, the West, is marked by an exceptional density of institutions. Even though some of these institutions are only partially overlapping, still if you just look at some of the acronyms, it tells you quite a lot about how dense the institutionalization is. So it's NATO, it's the EU, it's to an extent the OSCE, it's the G7, and others. So in other words, the West has the infrastructure for collective decision-making in place. It just needs to use that decision structure. We don't necessarily need to create new bodies to tackle the problems that I've outlined at the beginning, but we have to make those bodies that do exist work more effectively. Fourth factor, interaction and exchange. So even if we leave the purely interstate relations aside, the purely intergovernmental part aside, then still the West does seem to exist and be very vivid in terms of what it represents. So the volume and the density of personal communication, email, phone calls, Skype conversations, tourism, business exchanges, civil society interactions in general. All of that has been studied quite significantly, and it leads us to believe that there is something there that we might call the West, that there is a core around which these interactions revolve. And the argument then goes, those who are hopeful in regards to the future of the West would say, these interactions and these exchanges, they provide an organic grounding, or if you will, a glue to these institutions that I mentioned. So one is the politics and the politicians, political elites, and the economic elites doing their thing, interacting with each other. That's one aspect, that's one dimension. But there's a whole other civil society dimension that characterizes the West. And as we're going to talk a little bit about this in the workshop, hopefully, the argument goes that these interactions, they're not just loose talk, but they do create a sense of responsiveness and of we feeling or of identity, or collective identity. Fifth and final factor is values. So the argument is not just that people in Europe and North America talk a lot with each other and interact with each other a lot, trade a lot, and have certain institutions like NATO, for example, in common. But it's also that they fundamentally agree on some essential values, things that are not necessarily lucrative, but things that are good in and of themselves, values. So the argument goes, the West is going to stick together and perhaps even have a sort of renaissance because it does fundamentally agree on these values, such as democracy, the rule of law, conception of human rights that is very much focused on the individual, the rights and the liberties of the individual, the dignity of the individuals. Clearly, materialist culture which values material gains and material achievements. A meritocratic culture, a culture that applauds excellence in all its forms, whether academic or otherwise, and so on and so forth. So you get the drift, right? So values. So allegedly, these are going to help glue the West together. But let's look a little bit more closely at these factors and maybe paint a negative picture. So I said the first trajectory is the rise or the fall of the West, the renaissance of the West, or the decline, perhaps a terminal decline of the West. If that is the option that we have, maybe these 5 factors that I mentioned, maybe they are not working in favor of the West. Maybe they're also helping to pull away the West from each other. Maybe they are creating more conflict and cohesion. So just very briefly, we go back to the first factor, functional pressures. It's true, of course, there are a lot of problems out there that it would be good to solve, but it doesn't mean that the Western states agree with what these problems are. And we see a lot of disagreement, as I said at the very beginning, a lot of disagreement about what the fundamental problems are. And even in those issues where most Western states agree, say, the role of terrorism, that terrorism is a significant problem, states then disagree on what kind of solutions we should use. So should we declare war on terror and treat it like a military operation, or is it more to be handled like a police operation? So more like organized crime. And that's not just semantics, it's a fundamentally different approach to fighting terrorism. And I do think we see that represented in the West. So different states arguing for different solutions because they have a very fundamentally different definition of the problem. Second, economic interdependence. Well, of course, the economic incentives. I mentioned the free trade agreement, if that worked. But it's very questionable whether economics by themselves create political interest. There are very significant historical examples that we can highlight to show that economics does not equal politics. Right? So joint economic gain doesn't equal collective political interest. So think of the First World War. The major combatants in the First World War had highly integrated economies, integrated to a degree that we now see again. So extremely interdependent economies. It didn't prevent them from fighting the bloodiest war in the history of mankind to that day. Right? So there's a disjuncture between economics and politics. So maybe economics are creating more problems politically, or at the very least they don't add anything to political cohesion. The same thing with institutions. So of course we do have these institutions, but every single institution that I mentioned, NATO, EU, OSCE, G7, have quite significant problems. Right? So if NATO is sort of the core, as many people argue it is, the core of the West, I disagree, but many people make that argument, then of course NATO has been in quite a serious disagreement over its future since the end of the Cold War. So one of the big debates, as you know, is there going to be a global NATO? Is Afghanistan not just the exception that proves the rule, but is Afghanistan sort of leading, showing how the future of NATO should be? Should it be a global intervention force? Or should it be more confined to the transatlantic area? The fourth factor, interaction exchange. Of course, there's lots of tourism, lots of trade, civil society interactions, and so on. And some of these institutions that are funding this academy are representative of these exchanges. But close exchanges, as you know from your families or your partners, your boyfriends and girlfriends, your husbands and wives, the more closely you know somebody, the more areas that you have to disagree on. Right? There are some things that you disagree and fight about with people that you know well, that you would never dream of disagreeing or fighting about with somebody that you don't know as well. And this, I think, creates a lot of transatlantic sort of debates and tension on the civil society level. So think of examples like the death penalty. We wouldn't disagree. Let's assume we're all against death penalty, just for the sake of argument. Then, of course, we don't like it that adolescents get executed in certain states in the U.S. We don't like the fact that mentally handicapped people are at times executed. We don't like the fact that people who have not had a fair trial by our standards are being executed. But we care about it because we read about it in the news, we know people from the US, we're in touch with that kind of culture. I don't even know whether, say, the Philippines have the death penalty. I think they do, I'm not quite sure, because I've never read about it. Because I've heard about it, I've never heard a discussion about it. So I'm never going to disagree with a Filipino or Filipina about the death penalty in the Philippines. Right? So interaction can create cohesion, but it can also create tension. And then finally, the values aspect. If it's true that we all agree on democracy, the rule of law, human rights, materialism, and other things that I mentioned earlier, so fundamental values, well, that's great, but there might not be anything particularly Western about it. There are lots of other non-Western states, of course, who agree that democracy is a good way of governing, that the rule of law makes sense, that human beings have dignity, that you shouldn't say be tortured, and so on. So that's not a great argument. You could counter argue. It's not a strong argument for saying these values are going to help the West to renew itself. So that's the first sort of trajectory, either a decline or a drift, or perhaps a renewal, strengthening of the West, and some of the major factors that people would try to highlight to make the argument in favor of renewal or against renewal. Let me talk a little bit more briefly about a second trajectory that's a little bit more complicated and perhaps more interesting. So maybe the choice is not between more West or less West, stronger or weaker. Maybe the future is a little bit more, it's going to be a little bit more complex, complicated, and interesting. So let me explore that for a couple of minutes. So the second trajectory could be that instead of one unified West, or one West that's either declining or rising again, reviving, that we see a different kind of makeup. Something that I would call the patchwork West. So it might be the case that in the future we're going to see a patchwork of various more issue-based networks between different actors. So NATO and the EU might not necessarily go away, they will probably persist, and they will also sometimes operate on certain of these issues that I mentioned, and sometimes they will clash. The EU is probably, or might be, I would say it's probably going to try and develop more of an integrated personality. And we might see in that second trajectory how the EU becomes a more full-blown actor that doesn't just act in on small-scale issues, but that also acts on high politics. We see certain instances of this where Europe tries to speak with one voice. Sometimes it works, most often it doesn't at the moment. But I'm very certain that there's going to be a concerted effort to try and develop a foreign policy persona. Then, because the overall cohesion of the West might not increase, we might see other forms of governance, other networks of actors coming together to form coalitions of the willing, if you like, to tackle certain issues. So again, that's going to be issue-specific. And these will be bilateral and unilateral. So instead of going through the whole NATO machinery with all the states that are involved, instead of going through the EU machinery with even as many states involved, states will always find it attractive to to try and tackle things bilaterally or in small fora. And we see this already, of course, and this is going to persist, and I would say probably increase. So whether it's the Nordic countries, the Baltic group, or the so-called UK-US, the Anglo-American special relationship, or the French-German axis that a lot of people say is at the core of the EU, these bilateral and unilateral groupings are going to increase in significance and are going to handle some of the problems that in this scenario, the larger West can agree on. A final factor within that second trajectory might be renationalization. That's something that I would argue against. I think it would not be the right solution to the complex problems we have. But it is an option that certain states will try to increasingly extricate themselves from the EU. You might start with the Eurozone, you might then spill over the EU. They might want to extricate themselves from NATO, either by formal exit, which would be the most dramatic option, or more likely by just sort of de facto retreating, committing less troops, being less engaged, de-emphasizing institutions such as NATO and the EU. So in other words, we might see few states who are now active members of the West become like Switzerland. So it works for the Swiss, right? So stable country, rich, quite highly regarded in the world, but not really a member of anything but the United Nations. for the last 10 years or so. So if you add all of this together, the NATO and EU partially cooperating, partially clashing, the EU trying to become a more unified actor, but maybe not succeeding, at least not in the near future, and then the increase of bilateral relationships and unilateral relationships, and then maybe on the outskirts, as outliers, a few states sort of renationalizing, pulling out of multilateral frameworks. If we add all of this together, this is what I would call the patchwork West. And I think that's an interesting sort of second scenario that is not being captured by the first one, where it's just about sort of the rise and decline, the drift or the renewal of the West. The second scenario could be a transition phase. Right? So it could be the case that this patchwork, this messy scenario that I just outlined is just a transition phase on the way to decline or on the way to renewal. But it could also be permanent.